China is dramatically revising its death toll in Wuhan, the city where COVID-19 originated, adding 50% more deaths. Officials now say nearly 4,000 people died from the novel coronavirus, an increase of about 1,300. This as the U.S. intelligence community is looking into whether the coronavirus accidentally spread from a lab in Wuhan that was studying samples of the virus instead of from bats in the animal market. One U.S. official telling NBC News it's a possibility, although not most likely possibility. Joining me now is Jeremy Bash, former chief of staff at the CIA and the Pentagon. We've been hearing different messages here. We heard Mike Pompeo and the president pushing forward on this Wuhan theory about the labs. The president was saying, well, I can't really say, but Pompeo really went forward there, but not Mike Esper, not the chairman of the Joint Chiefs from the Pentagon, saying that it is less likely. What do we know about the accuracy of our own intelligence?
Well, I think we have to wait to hear from the intelligence professionals, Andrea. That's not something that the president often does, but it's so important here because an allegation that China allowed a virus to escape from a lab through negligence or worse, perhaps because they were trying to engineer something, that's an explosive charge that could really inflame geopolitical tensions. And I think the president has sent mixed messages on China, Andrea. If you'll recall, on January 24th, the president basically stood up and said, the United States greatly appreciates the efforts and transparency that China has undertaken. It will all work out well. And he said on behalf of the American people in particular, I want to thank Xi Jinping. So right out of the gate, the president was praising Xi Jinping. He was congratulating China. He was praising them for their transparency of all things. And in fact, we know they've been anything but.
And when we look at China, of course, China is the source of the chemicals that we need for the tests to be processed in labs. China is the source, of course, of the masks and a lot of the other equipment that we need. So this mixed message is contributing to the supply chain as well.
Well, that's right, Andrea. And I think an integrated approach to China has to have several elements. Number one, we definitively have to be tough on them on the lack of transparency. Also, I don't think that we should be running headlong into rewarding them with trade deals like the Phase 1 or Phase 1 follow-on trade deal. But we do have to work collaboratively with China and other countries to solve this problem. Scapegoating this as the Chinese virus or denigrating or engaging in xenophobic rhetoric about China or Chinese individuals, I think is counterproductive because, of course, a virus knows no political boundaries, does not understand nation states. It can infect anyone, anywhere. And the presence of the virus in China or elsewhere could ultimately and will ultimately harm American and American citizens. So we have to work globally to take on this challenge. And I think efforts to try to divide us between countries or try to look for scapegoats is fundamentally counterproductive.
Do you trust the intelligence that the president is getting with the shakeups and the firings and the lack of an independent watchdog now over the intelligence community?
I trust the intelligence professionals. I've been talking to many of them over the last several weeks. They are nose down, working diligently. They've had to shift some of their modes of operation, in some cases engaging in telework, working remotely, using other methods and means to collect and analyze intelligence. And I think they're doing a very diligent job at providing as much information up the chain of command as they have with respect to China and other countries, and with respect to what other countries are doing and how they're reacting to the coronavirus crisis. But I do worry, Andrew, and I think this is pointed out in your question, I do worry that the president sometimes doesn't listen, doesn't heed that advice. We heard earlier on in the administration times when the president said, don't tell me about what Vladimir Putin is doing, and he'll go out and praise Xi Jinping, as I referenced on January 24th, despite the intelligence warning that the intelligence community provides.
And Jeremy, one of the things that I was just referencing with Willem Marx is that the White House put out this rosy statement about the G7 video conference that they had yesterday, saying that everyone agreed and criticized the WHO, and that's not what happened, according to Angela Merkel, according to Justin Trudeau and some of the other world leaders. They, in fact, pushed back against the president's criticism of the WHO.
That's right. And this is precisely the moment, Andrea, that we need to have global leadership from Washington, from the White House, to bring together countries, whether it's in the G7 formation or the G20 or other multilateral institutions. Again, I think the way we have to think about this virus is it's a new kind of threat. It's a global threat that affects every country, every person, all of humanity, in fact. And only through a global approach will we be able to confront this crisis once and for all.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.